It's Game Boy World, and this is Bases Loaded for Game Boy. We're just a few weeks shy of Game Boy's first birthday, and here we have the best baseball game on the system. Well, okay, Bases Loaded for Game Boy didn't exactly have the highest bar to clear. And it's not exactly an absolute triumph either. It's an early Game Boy sports game, so you know what that means. It's a miserable, unbalanced grind if you play it against the CPU. No, if you want to have a tolerable experience with Bases Loaded, you need to pony up for a second copy of the game that you can play with a friend. It's funny because people are quick to criticize the dual cartridge release format pioneered by Pokemon, but really the need to buy 2 copies of a game to make it even borderline enjoyable had existed from the very beginning of the Game Boy's life. Pokemon, at least, had a pretty solid solo game. Bases Loaded, like most Game Boy sports titles we've seen so far, did not. This was Game Boy's blessing and curse, the link cable. The logistics of the system necessitated a different approach for multiplayer experiences than were possible on consoles. For baseball games on NES, 2 players could take turns sitting in front of the same television on a single console. You can't really do that with a system whose 2-inch LCD screen is designed for use by a single person, hence the link cable. In a way, linked play is much more satisfying than sharing a single console, since in many cases each player has the opportunity to approach the action from an optimal angle, rather than trying to play, say, tennis or baseball while spending half the game trying to judge the movement and distance of balls on the far side of the court or field. The downside, of course, is that on Game Boy, the link cable itself required a somewhat cumbersome setup process. And again, this was before download play existed. Each person needed to own not only a Game Boy, but also a copy of the game in question. There's no easy answer for which approach to multiplayer is best, and in fact that debate continues to be one of the biggest religious divides in gaming. Nintendo prefers couch co-op, hence their slow adoption of online play, while other platform holders have gone all in on internet play, the logical evolution of the link cable. What this means for Bases Loaded, though, is simply that playing solo is a great way to hate life, hate video games, and hate the people who ruin your life by making video games. The computer has no ethics and no constraints here, and the single-player mode is kind of like playing Street Fighter against the CPU on a high difficulty level. Just like the CPU's guile could somehow charge and toss a sonic boom while moving forward, the CPU team here has an uncanny tendency to react perfectly to your actions. Pitch an outside sinker? The instant you release the ball, the batter miraculously scoots forward in the batting box to hit it squarely. And of course, when you're at bat, you basically have to hit a home run in order to avoid the CPU instantly appearing directly where the ball will land. Needless to say, of course, the reverse is never true. CPU pitchers offer no telltale signs of their strategies, and fielding is exasperating, since the camera makes it difficult to judge the arc of a fly ball and tends to cut your outfielders out of view until the ball is way out, and it's much too late to maneuver to where it'll land. Single-player sports games basically end up going one of 2 ways, now and forever. They're either laughably easy, or else they're infuriatingly difficult. Jalico went the latter route here, and the CPU has huge advantages over you in both offense and defense. These factors don't necessarily improve when you play against another person, but the fact that 2 humans would be in the same boat as one another, that is, equally disadvantaged, goes a long way toward mitigating the frustrations of Bases Loaded. In the person versus person sense, Bases Loaded actually works quite nicely. It offers a much greater wealth of options than Nintendo's archaic baseball did at launch, especially when it comes to pitching. You can put a lot of spin on the ball, guiding it across the plate with a curve, a drop, or some blazing fast muscle behind it. Fatigue factors in as well. The more aggressively you pitch, the more quickly your pitcher tires. A worn-out pitcher lobs slow, easy balls over the plate. Perfect fodder for an opponent to score a base hit or even a homer. You need to keep an eye on pitcher performance and find a fresh replacement, and the bullpen is needed. Of course, this being a sports game of its particular vintage, there's a great deal that's not explained within the game itself. Things like team and pitcher stats. You need to check against their reference charts in the game manual for that kind of info. In other words, Bases Loaded is a long way from living up to the standards we've come to expect from modern sports games. It's hardly user-friendly, especially to single users. As so often tends to be the case, it's the kind of game that seemed pretty decent 25 years ago because it's all we had. But today there's very little reason to go back to it. Really, the most interesting thing about Bases Loaded for Game Boy is that it actually isn't Bases Loaded. Despite coming from Bases Loaded publisher Jalico, this entry in the series was never intended to be part of that franchise. In Japan, Bases Loaded for Game Boy was called Baseball Kids. The actual Bases Loaded series, however, was called Moeru Puro Yaku, which translates roughly into Burning Spirits, Pro Baseball. I poked around some Japanese blogs, and they seemed somewhat bewildered that Baseball Kids was lumped together with Moero Pro Yaku overseas, since one clearly states kids in the title while the other describes itself as pro. They're two different things. And indeed, Bases Loaded for Game Boy lacks perhaps the most defining trait of the Moero Pro Yaku games, the cool, over-the-shoulder camera perspective. The low midfield angle Jaleco took with NES games was an important step toward the maturation of baseball games as a genre. It broke the genre away from the fixed, top-down, super deformed cartoon baseball style that dominated Japanese consoles, and it pushed for a greater realism and a perspective more directly reminiscent of the televised sport. It wasn't perfect, but it had a huge impact in its day. In fact, the original Famicom game was so successful that it's got a bit of a reputation as a kusoge, that is, a crappy game. From what I can tell, that has less to do with the quality of the game than the fact that the game was produced and sold in such tremendous quantities that it has approximately zero value now. I guess you could say Bases Loaded also helped establish the trend of sports games doing a terrible job at holding their value. But really, it's not just any game that is available so easily and so cheaply that you can literally bathe in it, like a sad retro gaming version of Scrooge McDuck. In any case, Bases Loaded for Game Boy lacks the visual and stylistic impact of the true Bases Loaded series. It looks more along the lines of Nintendo Baseball or Famistar, aka RBI Baseball, and it plays pretty much like any other sports game of the era. Mildly amusing, but ultimately not all that fun. For more underwhelming sports games, and there's plenty to come, keep reading GameBoyWorld.com. This video was made possible through the support of Patreon backers, and through cool people like you, who have picked up Game Boy World 1989 as a book on Amazon.com.